There are a large number of myths surrounding the concepts of software engineering. Every group that works with software engineers is going to have their own misguided beliefs. Today, I will look at some of those common myths from 3 different groups that they might have. The first group we'll look at is managers, customers, and then finally developers. So let's look at some management myths. These are the myths that managers are going to have. And now these might not be the managers of a software development team. We're going to talk about their own myths in a minute. We're talking about more of your senior management, your what we call the C-level suite or the directors. And they're going to have various myths of their own that they're going to believe and tell other people. So let's look at a couple of them. First is, we have a book of standards. Well, that's nice. And a book of standards to follow, everything from naming to communication, etc., is great. But is that book up to date? Is it actually being used? Is it effective for what we're doing? That's something that we can see happen all the time, is there's a book of standards and it sits on the shelf collecting dust, never to be used, updated, etc. I've even worked at places that didn't have a book of standards, despite the fact that management thought they did. Sometimes they thought it was just so obvious, and there were 2 different groups of developers. They developed different applications, and most of the time, 90% of the time, they didn't interact with each other. But they found out a case where they needed to interact with each other. Turns out, both of them made a logical assumption about how to store the dates. And it turned out that they stored them completely different. Yes, both of them were logical, but because that book of standards was not effectively being used, or maybe didn't even exist, these 2 pieces couldn't communicate without special additional work being moved in. The next myth that we hear managers talk about all the time is, if we get behind schedule, we'll just add more people. Well, that's nice, but where are these people going to come from? The magic people fairy? He just doesn't deliver properly trained, effective people to be at your doorstep when you need them. Which gets to the next question. Okay, if you do find people, are they properly trained? That's always a good question. Who's going to get them up to speed on a project? In fact, it can take weeks, if not months, to get people up to speed. The general guideline or commonly held belief is it takes 2 to 3 months for someone to be truly effective and make real progress on a project. Not only that, it takes time to go find people. So they estimate that for every $10,000 in annual salary, it takes about a month to find that person. So let's say you have someone who makes $60,000 a year. Well, it's going to take approximately 6 months between requesting a job opening from HR posting it, interviewing it, then be able to start, etc. You can expect it takes about 6 months in general. Then add another 2 to 3 months to get them fully up to speed. This creates a huge backlog. And just because someone wasn't ready. Okay, so this can be a huge issue. Now, that's not a hard set rule. In fact, I remember being brought onto a project. I worked for an organization. They moved me to another project, and they fully expected it was going to take 4 to 6 weeks for me to get up to schedule and to start working on stuff, probably closer to that 6 weeks. Luckily, I did very similar types of things, and that's why they figured, ooh, this is a lot better than hiring an outside person. That's going to take the 2 to 3 months. Okay? So they figured 6 weeks for me to get up to speed. Turns out I started turning stuff in 2 weeks, and I was embarrassed it took 2 weeks. I felt bad. I was working really hard at it, and they were thrilled and ecstatic that it took only 2 weeks. They were expecting 6. So having that downtime and the time we are not as effective is going to happen no matter what. How much is going to depend upon how closely they are tied to doing that type of project. The next thing that you hear is, well, we can decide to go out and outsource a third party, especially for really cheap if we go to maybe this country or that country. Well, no, you can't necessarily, because remember, you need to be able to find that outsourcing agency, get them on staff and working for you, bring them up to speed. And sometimes the people that you hire, that you see online ads for $5 an hour or $10 an hour, there's a reason they're being paid that. Quite frankly, it's because they are not up to a level of expectations. If you don't believe me, and this company paid more than that $5 or $10 an hour, but look at Boeing, specifically Boeing with the 737 MAX. They decided to outsource some of their flight control software. Now, they sent it to another company, another country. It was a good salary for those people compared to paying about $80 an hour for people inside the US. However, their quality control wasn't nearly as good. The end result was that 2 planes full of passengers crashed. That meant over 250 people died. Not only was there a loss of life, they had to ground an entire fleet. They couldn't sell that plane for over a year. Cost them a lot of money. There was investigations from the government and the FAA and other governments. Orders were canceled, and it nearly put the company out of business. Sure, they saved a little bit of money on the front end, but anything they saved was not made up because they didn't have the quality control. And one of the things that they had to learn was that not only is there cost savings, but you have to manage. And if you can't manage something internally when you can see people every day, there is no way that you're going to manage a third party nearly as well. And that means that your quality is going to go down. Okay, so these are some common things that you're going to hear about from management. All right, so let's look at customer myths. So the first one is a general statement of objectives is enough to start with. We can always fill in the details later. Okay, while a comprehensive list is not always possible, being purposefully ambiguous is just foolish. Changes down the line might require major revisions and put to jeopardy in schedule if we don't have all the requirements in place. The next most common thing you're going to see is, I'm going to ask for just one more thing. We talked about this earlier, being scope creep. And just this one little piece usually isn't a big deal. A lot of times, those little scope creep things that I've gotten in my past only take a couple hours to maybe a half a day to implement. It's a minor thing. If it was a big thing, people would put up, no, we can't do that. That's too long. That's too big. But those little things, and like I mentioned earlier, it's death by 1,000 paper cuts. One 1-hour addition to a new feature doesn't kill the process. 1,000 little 1 hours puts us weeks and weeks behind schedule. Scope creep is going to derail any schedule. The next thing is software requirements are always changing, but changing is easy because software is flexible. That's not correct. Software changes are often like dominoes, and one change creates another change, which creates another. And this can have a direct correlation to being overrun in cost. Finally, let's look at some practitioner, or if you prefer, developer myth. Now, we're going to say practitioner because we realize that it's not just software developers. There's often software and hardware that's being worked together. So let's look at it combined, and we'll call it practitioners for now. And the first most common myth that they believe is once we're done, once we've written the program, our job is done. And I just have to laugh at that. We have updates to hardware and other system software that's going to require changes. You don't know how many times I've seen an update to the operating system that creates a cascading change effect. Remember, we just talked about that. Okay? So yes, a change in requirements might be by the customer, but it might come from an outside source, and we're left having to handle it. And the fact of the matter is, this might occur years later. Users are going to ask for revisions. Users are never satisfied with how something is. They're always doing updates. If you look at it, that's why so many softwares are on version 20, 50, or if you look at some of the modern web browsers, 100 and something. We're always going to be having updates that we need to make. Remember, part of having high quality software is that it's easily updatable. In fact, it is estimated that between 60 and 80% of time spent on a software project is done after it's been delivered. The next myth that you're going to see is until our software is running, we have no idea on how to assess the quality. Well, that's not correct. There's lots of different reviews that we can use to identify issues. There's lots of different types of testing, and we're going to be talking about some of those different types of testing to deliver better, higher quality software projects. Finally, a lot of practitioners believe that software engineering is just going to take too much time. They believe it's all about paperwork and tracking, and yes, there is that component. However, if done right, the goal is to create quality products that require less upkeep, are more efficient, more effective, and will be delivered on time and on budget. So yes, there may be changes that have to be made. In fact, the longer a company has gone without software engineering practices put in place, the more changes are going to have to be made. But once those changes are starting to be made, the changes from project to project are going to be going down, down, down.